So let's talk about that clip. So in the clip, the ladies walk into the bar and John Nash sees them, and what he realizes is that the guys are all going to have an incentive to go after the one young lady who is better looking than the other ones. And the problem with that is going to be that they're going to go try to get her attention, and they're all going to essentially block each other. And then what's going to happen is once they've been rejected by the good-looking one, then they're going to try to go after her friends, but her friends are going to be upset because they didn't go after the friends first, and so everybody goes home empty-handed. And what he realizes is there's a better outcome. And the better outcome is that what we need to do is ignore the good-looking one. If what we will do is, if we'll ignore her and just go directly after her friends, then her friends will be much more receptive to our advances, and then everybody's going to get paired off with one of these girls and everybody's happy. And that's where they end. And he jumps up from the table and he says something about Adam Smith being wrong, and he runs out and he thanks the lady on his way out, and then he goes and writes his dissertation, which won him the Nobel Prize in economics. And when I ask my classes, we will watch that in a face-to-face class, and if I ask them, does that do a good job of illustrating what I just taught you? A lot of times students will say, yeah, it does. It demonstrates that sometimes there's a better strategy. But I would argue that the movie does a terrible job of depicting the actual prisoner's dilemma. And the reason is because what John Nash, the way they depict it is that John Nash says there's a better strategy. The better strategy is that we all agree not to go after the one good-looking one. But now think about what that collusive agreement creates. It contains the seeds of its own destruction. If we all agree not to go after the good-looking one, if you know your friends are not going to go after the good-looking one, what's in your best interest? Well, it's in your best interest to go after the good-looking one. But that's true for all of them. So they can form this collusive agreement to ignore her. But if you know everybody's going to ignore her, then it's in your best interest to be the one person who doesn't ignore her, because then she's going to be more receptive to you. And yet, all of them face that same incentive, so the end result is that they all still go after the good-looking one, right? So, in my opinion, the movie, while I like the movie, and I think there are some good things about the movie, it's very interesting, and I think if you're interested in learning more about John Nash, reading the book that movie is based on it's a very interesting book. John Nash was killed not too many years ago. He and his wife were riding in a taxi cab in New York that was hit by another car, and it killed both of them. But John Nash had a very interesting life, and in a lot of ways a very tragic life, because he suffered from schizophrenia. So I think the movie is decent, but I don't think that they do a very good job of actually illustrating the conflicting incentives that the prisoner's dilemma is designed to demonstrate. Let's take that prisoner's dilemma, because in this class we're not really that interested in whether or not criminals confess. We're more interested in how firms behave. And so let's take this prisoner's dilemma, and let's think about how it would work if we had two firms competing against each other. So let's think about a duopoly game, and this will be a more simple game than the one we had with the two firms selling water. So let's suppose we have two firms, and these two firms are in a town. Suppose it's Walmart and Target. And let's suppose both of the stores sell some game system. That's the Each firm sells the gaming system. I'm not going to demonstrate how out of touch I am with gaming systems by giving you the name of one, because it'll just make me look foolish. So whatever your favorite gaming system is, that's the one we're talking about. So Walmart sells it, Target sells it. They're the only two places that the people in town can buy it. And let's pretend they can't go to another town to buy it. If anybody wants to buy the gaming system, they have to buy it from one of those two places. And let's suppose that the manager of each store has to decide whether to charge a low price or whether to charge a high price. So the two strategies are to charge a low price or charge a high price. So let me go ahead and give you the game matrix here. Let's set this up. Same way we set up our prisoner's dilemma. So each of these stores, each of the managers is going to have those two strategies. Let's put Target up here at the top, and let's put Walmart over here. And let's put, let's suppose the two prices, let's suppose the low price is $400 and the high price is $600. So those are the two choices. We could have more choices, but we want to keep this fairly simple. So let's suppose we put our two strategies right here. Charge $600 or $400. Walmart can charge $600 or $400. Let's divide these cells in half, and we'll put the payoff to Target up in the top right corner, and we'll put the payoff to Walmart in the bottom left corner of each of these cells. Let's suppose if both of them sell it for $400, let's suppose that they each make $7,500 profit. On the other hand, if they both sell it for a high price, let's suppose they both make $10,000 in profit. Now, if those were the only two things that they had to worry about, then clearly what they want to do is both sell it for $600. Both stores will make more profit if they will agree to sell it for $600 than they would if they both sell it for $400. Here's the catch, though. Let's suppose that one of them sells it for $600 while the other one sells it for $400. In that case, the one that sells it for $400 is going to be able to steal customers away from the other one. And so the one that sells it for $400, let's suppose they make $15,000 in profit, and the one that sells it for $600 makes $5,000 in profit. Down here, it's Target that's selling it for $600 and Walmart that's selling it for $400. So Walmart would get the $15,000 in profit, and Target gets the $5,000 in profit. And so what we've got here is the classic prisoner's dilemma. The best outcome for the two firms is for them to both sell it for $600. The problem is, if you'll analyze this game the way I taught you to analyze a game, you'll see that selling it for $400 is the dominant strategy. And so the likely outcome of this game is that outcome. Both of them selling it for $400, earning less profit than if they would sell it for $600. And you might think, well, they should just agree to sell it for $600. Well, keep in mind that colluding is against the law, but let's suppose they do agree. Well, if you're Target and I'm Walmart, and I know we have agreed to sell it for $600, and I think you're going to sell it for $600, it's in my best interest to sell it for $400, because then I can get this $15,000 in profit instead of $10,000. I'd rather have $15,000 than $10,000. So selling it for the low price is a dominant strategy, even though there's a better outcome. Now again, if this was a repeated game, or if these firms could somehow punish each other, every once in a while I have a student raise their hand and say, hey, you know what, I've figured this out. All they need to do, all Walmart and Target need to do is sign a legally binding contract to sell it for $600. That's illegal, right? You can't do that because the whole collusive agreement between firms is illegal. It's outlawed by the Sherman Antitrust Act and a whole bunch of antitrust legislation. So if you show up at, in front of a judge and say, hey, look, I've got this agreement. I'm the manager of Walmart and the manager of Target and I both signed this agreement to collude, you're going to get in big trouble. So you can't do that. So it all has to be done secretly. And we tend to see very little collusion. Now, that doesn't mean we see no collusion. If you look at kind of classic examples of collusion out there in the real world, the airline industry, there's been situations where different airlines have colluded with each other. Actually, if you're interested, there's a fascinating podcast. The podcast is one edition of This American Life. And the title of the podcast is The Fix Is In. It was done, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It's been a number of years ago that it was when I first heard it. And it is a fascinating podcast about a story of a guy who had been engaged in some illegal activity, but he agreed to be kind of an informant for the FBI to help them nail some international firms that were colluding to fix the price of something. Off the top of my head, I can't even remember what it was they were selling. But it is a fascinating discussion of exactly the secret nature of collusion and how firms do it out there in the real world and how they can get caught doing it. So I would highly encourage you to listen to that podcast. Let's talk about some other examples of how we can apply this collusion or inability to collude result that we've just gotten, because it applies to a lot of very interesting things out there in the real world that don't really have anything to do with firms making decisions. Notice in this chapter that we are not drawing the cost curves for firms and looking where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, but that would be going on behind the scenes here. These firms would be, to the extent that they can, trying to figure out where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The problem for them is there's a massive amount of uncertainty. They don't know exactly what demand curve they're going to face any particular day. And so knowing what their marginal revenue curve it's very challenging. They don't know what it looks like. And it can look different from one day to the next depending upon what the other firms are doing. So that's what we're focusing on, why we're focusing on the game theory aspect of it rather than just a marginal cost curve and a marginal revenue curve. But keep in mind, these firms are still going to be trying to maximize their profit. It's just that there's uncertainty. So let's think of some other ways that we can apply this prisoner's dilemma idea. One of them is in terms of advertising. So we tend to see a fair amount of advertising with oligopolies. The problem is for oligopolies, the advertising typically doesn't help them. We see a lot of it. But let's think about why. If we go back and we look at monopolistic competition, we talked about the fact that there's going to be a strong incentive for those firms to advertise, to market themselves. And the reason is they need to try to further differentiate their product. If they can do that, they can shift that residual demand curve to the right, and at least for a while they have a shot at making a positive economic profit. So we see a lot of advertising in that type of market structure. With a oligopoly, we also see a lot of advertising. You see Coke and Pepsi do a lot of advertising. You see the airlines do advertising. You see cable companies advertise. You see DirecTV and Dish Network advertising. You see a lot of advertising here. The problem is the advertising for these firms tends to be relatively unproductive, and the firms would be much happier if they didn't have to do it. So let's think about a couple of cigarette companies advertising. So this is kind of a classic example that's described in a lot of economics textbooks. Let me show you kind of what the game matrix looks like for two cigarette companies that are deciding whether or not to advertise. Let's make our two companies Marlboro and let's say Camel. Let's suppose that each company has two strategies. They can either advertise or not advertise. I'll abbreviate that. So advertise or not advertise. Let's break up the cells into halves so we can write the payoffs. Let's suppose that if both of them advertise, Marlboro gets $3 billion in profit, and let's say Camel also gets $3 billion in profit. If, on the other hand, they don't advertise, let's suppose that Marlboro gets $4 billion in profit, and Camel gets $4 billion in profit. And you might ask, well, why? That doesn't make sense. Why would the payoffs look like that? Well, actually, it makes perfect sense. If you think about why people choose to smoke, people do not choose to smoke because of advertising. So it's not the case that a non-smoker is out getting gas at the pumps and they're sitting there filling up their car and they look up on top of the pumps and they see that, hey, lo and behold, Marlboro cartons are on sale this week. And think to themselves, you know what? I've never smoked in my life, but they've got a sale on Marlboro cartons, so I'm going to go get me a carton and start smoking. That's not why people choose to smoke. People choose to smoke because their friends smoke, their parents smoke. They choose to smoke for reasons other than advertising. Okay, so the advertising doesn't get new customers for Marlboro or Camel. So they would be better off if they didn't spend the money on the advertising. So from their perspective, this is the best outcome. If they advertise, they're not going to generate new smokers. That dollars spent on advertising, it has no payoff for them, and so they end up making less profit overall. Here's what does happen when you advertise, though. If you advertise and the competitor doesn't, then people who are already smokers start to switch brands. So if Camel chooses to advertise, while Marlboro chooses not to advertise, Camel can steal some of the market away from Marlboro. And so the firm that advertises is going to make a bigger profit than the firm that doesn't. So let's suppose that if Camel chooses to advertise, but Marlboro doesn't. We're up here in this box. Let's suppose Marlboro gets $2 billion in profit and Camel gets $5 billion in profit. On the other hand, if Marlboro chooses to advertise while Camel chooses not to advertise, then Marlboro's going to get the $5 billion in profit and Camel gets the $2 billion. Now, if you'll analyze this the way I taught you to do it, what you'll see is that the likely outcome for this game is both of them to advertise. Advertising is a dominant strategy. And so the likely outcome is right up here. Even though there is a better outcome for these two firms, they would rather not advertise, but advertising is a dominant strategy. Let me pause here for a second before we talk more about this and just show you that the likely outcome is not always going to be up in the upper left-hand corner, because in this game, the likely outcome is in the bottom right-hand corner. It depends on where you put your two strategies. So you could analyze this game, and another person could analyze the game and switch the numbers here, and their likely outcome would be in a different location. Okay, so the reason I say that is don't get used to thinking that once you put the game matrix together, you just need to circle the top left corner. That's not how it's always going to work. So let's go back to this example. If you were to go back to the early 70s, cigarette companies did a lot of advertising on television. And you can actually get on YouTube and search for old cigarette commercials, and they're incredibly odd to watch, because we just can't imagine having a commercial like that on television. But they used to have commercials, and then Congress decided that what they would do is they would punish the cigarette industry by not allowing them to advertise on television. They would have to advertise in magazines, or they could advertise in stores or other places, but they couldn't advertise on television. And at the time, the cigarette companies kind of stood back and said, oh gosh, don't do that to us. Please don't make it illegal for us to advertise. But they didn't really oppose it very much. And so what ended up happening was the legislation passed, and they prohibited the cigarette companies from advertising on television. And if you look at the profits that the cigarette companies earned, they went up after that. And you might ask, well, why? Well, here's why. Because the government solved the prisoner's dilemma for the cigarette companies. The government made advertising, at least on television, illegal. And that moved them down here to this outcome that they wanted to be at from the beginning. And so what you see is we still see a push for restrictions on cigarette companies and what they can do, and whether or not they can advertise within 20 feet of a candy counter, and as if advertising within 20 feet of a candy counter actually has anything to do with whether or not people smoke. We still see pressure put on to restrict the ability of cigarette companies to advertise, and the cigarette companies kind of standing back and saying, oh, you know what, don't do that, please don't do that. But that's exactly what they want. If you want to hurt the cigarette companies, let them advertise. Let them advertise wherever they want. Now, I'm not advocating that as something we should do. But if your goal is to drain the cigarette companies of dollars, you should make advertising easy for them, because it's not going to help them get new smokers, and they don't want to do it in the first place. So this is a good example of how we can use this prisoner's dilemma and what we know from it to understand something that we see out there in the real world. This also applies to a lot of other things. If we think about the arms race, I think your book may have a discussion of the arms race as a prisoner's dilemma. Here's the situation. If we think about two countries, let's make it simple. Two countries, two strategies. Either arm or disarm. So you either have nuclear weapons or you don't. Well, there are two inherently safe situations in the world. One situation is where nobody has any nuclear weapons, and the other situation is where everybody has a nuclear weapon. And that's a safe situation because of mutual assurance of destruction. If you're going to push the button to nuke another country, you know they're also going to push the button, so you're essentially pushing the button to kill yourself. So both of those are inherently safe situations. The unsafe thing is when one country has them and the other doesn't. And if you look at the outcome of that game, arming yourself is a dominant strategy. And so we tend to see countries arming themselves. And if you want to understand how we could somehow get to, probably without argument, a better outcome where nuclear weapons didn't even exist, I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind that that is the best outcome of the game. The problem is it's a dominant strategy to arm. So it's not the case that politicians are just stupid and that all they care about is killing everybody else, so that's why they want these weapons. It's a dominant strategy. If we want to understand how to change that, then we have to go, I've erased them, but if you go back to the conditions under which we would expect cooperation, if we want agreements, arms agreements, then we have to recognize that this world we live in is a repeated game. We have to have relationships between countries. So it's easier to cooperate if the countries have a relationship. So if countries are isolating themselves, that's not good for solving that prisoner's dilemma. If there's an ability to punish a country if they break the agreement, then we have a higher probability of observing cooperation. So setting up international organizations that have authority to punish a country if it does something that is not abiding by the agreement, that can be one way to get closer to that good outcome of not having any nuclear weapons at all. So the arms race is a good example of the prisoner's dilemma. Another excellent example is dirty campaigning. This is something that we're all used to seeing these days. It's something that people complain about, and if you go to the barber shop, you'll hear people talking about how politicians are just dirty these days and all they ever do is dirty campaigning. Well, if you think about it, it's a dominant strategy. Let's suppose nobody campaigns dirty. Okay? If nobody campaigns dirty, that's one possible outcome. Or if everybody campaigns dirty. If nobody campaigns dirty, then voters tend not to switch. If everybody campaigns dirty, voters tend not to switch. What happens, though, is if one person runs a clean campaign and the other person runs a dirty campaign, then voters tend to switch towards the person that's running the dirty campaign. Because if somebody's talking bad about your candidate and your candidate is not responding, then you start to think to yourself, you know what? If that wasn't true, I'd speak up and I'd say something. But if your candidate just keeps their mouth shut, then people start to think, well, maybe it's true. And they start to switch. And so what you start to realize real quickly is that if you want that dirty campaigning is a dominant strategy. Believe me, the candidates would love to not spend all the money that they have to spend running those dirty ads. They don't want to do that. It's not that politicians are inherently more dirty than anybody else. That's a shortcut to thinking. That's not the way it works. It's that if you are going to run a clean campaign, no matter what, you're probably going to lose. Unless somehow you are lucky enough to be running against another candidate who is not going to campaign dirty. And we do see some of that. Sometimes we do see two candidates that they don't really say anything bad about the other candidate. But here's the real thing. You might think, well, let's just outlaw dirty campaigning. Well, how do you do that? How do you outlaw something when you can't even define what it means to campaign dirty? If somebody voted for something and I point that out as a candidate, does that mean that that's a dirty campaign? I mean, you might not like that if you like the other person and I point out that they voted this way or they didn't vote this way. So somehow defining what it means to campaign dirty, that's impossible. So it's a dominant strategy and I don't know how to fix it. I guess we can think about using some of those conditions under which cooperation is more likely, but that's really challenging with dirty campaigning. So you can see that there are a lot of applications of this prisoner's dilemma, not just to firms and how firms make decisions, but to lots of other things that we tend to see. Game theory is very useful for analyzing sports situations. It's very useful for analyzing military strategy situations. It's really widely applicable to a lot of different things that we observe out there in the real world. So let's kind of conclude this discussion of oligopoly with a couple of different things. So the first thing is that collusion is unlikely. If I ask my students at the beginning of a principles class whether they think collusion is likely, many students will say that it's happening all the time, that all firms are colluding against us. No, they're not. They're not. As a matter of fact, we don't see collusion with perfect competition. If you think about the gasoline market, it's tempting to think that firms are colluding because when you drive into a town, you see that all the gas stations have a price that's pretty close to everybody else's. That tempts you into thinking that there has to be somebody behind it. But what's happening there is just that the incentives are driving everybody to that price. That's what happens when you have a market. Wherever the demand curve and the supply curve intersect, the price is going to be driven to that price. And so when you observe all of the gas stations having a price that's within a few cents of each other, it makes you think as if they're colluding. But they're not. They're just responding to the incentives that are created at their particular gas station. We don't see collusion, obviously, with monopoly, and we don't see collusion with monopolistic competition because there's so many firms that the number of firms is too high for them to collude. It's not until we get to oligopoly that we see collusion, and even then, it's hard for oligopolies to agree to collude and then stick to it. So collusion is unlikely, but it does sometimes happen. So let's say but sometimes happens. The second thing is that we have to keep in mind that firms have conflicting incentives. Firms have conflicting incentives. This is true with regards to a lot of things in life. There's not, actually most of the time, there's not one right answer. Life would be simple if there was always one right answer. But really that's what the study of economics is about, is understanding that everything has benefits and everything has costs. And sometimes there's uncertainty about those benefits and costs. And that makes problem solving challenging. It's one thing if you know exactly what the benefits are and exactly what the costs are. But there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty created by the fact that life itself contains randomness and is uncertain. It's uncertain in part because other people, their behavior is uncertain. The behavior of firms is uncertain. So firms have conflicting incentives, and that makes problem solving challenging. Here's the other thing. It's good for society that firms have a difficult time colluding. It's good for society that firms have a difficult time colluding. We're kind of taught to think that cooperation is always the best thing. That if we could always just cooperate, life would be way easier. There are times when that's true. I would argue, though, that there are lots of times we do not want people cooperating. We certainly don't want firms cooperating with each other, because when firms cooperate, that drives the price up for consumers. It's good for the firms if they can cooperate, but it's bad for consumers. It creates deadweight loss. And so it's a good thing that firms have a difficult time colluding. It's a good thing that criminals have a difficult time colluding. It's a good thing that the police are able to get criminals to confess. Society is made better off by that. So some types of cooperation are good, but there are lots of times when we do not want to observe cooperation. The other thing is, and let's finish with this, the more firms there are, the less likely cooperation is. The more firms there are, the less likely cooperation is. I would argue that this is also a useful piece of information to keep in mind when you're thinking about something like a conspiracy theory. So if you're thinking about some conspiracy, I would argue that we can use what we've learned right here to come up with a good rule of thumb for whether or not there's anything behind a conspiracy theory or not. And this piece of information right here is very useful. Any conspiracy theory that involves a lot of people, I'm not going to lend much credence to that. If there's a conspiracy theory that involves a lot of people to pull it off and a lot of people to keep their mouths shut, I'm not going to buy it. That's not to say that there aren't some conspiracy theories out there that are actually happening. I don't know. There have been conspiracies in the history of the world that we know of that involve some people keeping their mouths shut, and they did, or at least they did for a while. But if we're talking about large numbers of people keeping their mouths shut, or large numbers of people cooperating with each other to pull it off, I don't know. There's a lot of evidence that tells me that that's very unlikely. It's not completely unheard of, but the more people have to be involved in it, the less likely it is that they're all going to be able to cooperate and then continue to keep their mouths shut, unless there's some ability to punish them. And if there is, if they know that speaking up is going to get themselves killed, Well, yeah, that increases the probability. So we can generalize a lot of this information to other things besides just firms producing goods and services. But keep in mind, really what we're after here is this fourth market structure where we're talking about how this compares to monopoly and monopolistic competition and perfect competition. And this fits in with right in between monopoly and monopolistic competition, closer to monopoly. If we increase the number of firms, we get closer and closer to monopolistic competition. It depends on how differentiated the goods are. So hopefully this gives you an idea of some game theory stuff, and I will see you in a future video.